Welcome to another episode of my Wake-Up Call. This is the podcast where I find out a little bit about my guests, and I can safely say that so far, nearly all my guests have been up to all good, and they're waging a battle to some of the bad actors who are up to no good. And what I have to say to all of my guests is wage on, because we need that. So let me get to Scott Keller. He's a senior partner in McKinsey's Southern California office and co-author with Carolyn Dewar and Vikram Malhotra of CEO Excellence, the 6 mindsets that distinguish the best leaders from the rest. He co-leads the firm's global CEO Excellence service line. He spent his early consulting years working on business strategy and operational topics until his life was turned upside down when his second child was born with profound special needs. And I had the distinct pleasure of meeting that son prior to the podcast. After taking time off to attend to his family, he returned to McKinsey with a desire to bring the best of psychology, social science, and the field of human potential into the workplace. Boy, there must have been a lot of people rolling their eyes at McKinsey at what you were up to. Anyway, he's the co-founder of the Digital Divide Data and one of the few hundred people in history known to have traveled to every country in the world. His favorite place is with his family in Seal Beach, and he lives there with his wife, Fiona, and 3 boys, Lachlan, Jackson, and Camden. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you for having me. Very happy to be here.
Oh, the happiness and pleasure is mine. I will start as I do with most of my guests, which is to ask them to step back and think of what's the through line in your life. And if there was a purpose or calling, those are overused words, but they're not bad. And you think at the end of your life, it'll still be one of the main purposes and callings to your life. How would you answer that? Through line, purpose, calling, and tell us what that is. And then I'm going to try to practice what I preach and just listen. And tell us about an origin story. You know, as a child, what did you notice? What drew you towards it? And please, please, please unpack talking about your special needs son. And he's a special son. And maybe you'll throw in why you traveled to all these places. And we can talk about the book, by the way. You know, yeah, they reached out to me. Plug his book already. Plug his book. So we'll do
That's
all
right.
that.
CEO Excellence, go get it. Okay, we're done with that. Now we can talk origin story. Happy to talk about all that, Mark. And I go back to how I grew up. And at a very early age, this is I suspect going to be unique that you've heard from people. At a very early age, I was introduced to heavy metal music. And heavy metal music struck a chord in me, pun intended, I guess, where I loved it. I heard a song called "You've Got Another Thing Coming" by Judas Priest, a band that was popular at the time. And I went and I bought the cassette, and then I bought more and more and more. And the reason I tell that story is because at one point I realized when I was in high school that when I was walking around, I always had a song in my head. It was just like, oh, Iron Maiden, Run to the Hills, or, Twisted Sister, We're Not Going to Take It. It wasn't like I chose it. It would just be there. Meanwhile, most of the other people walking around were thinking about something. Like they were worried about something. They were, will this test go well? Or will this, meanwhile, I'm just walking around going, we're not gonna, and so I don't remember having a lot of self-reflection, but I do remember having a lot of being in the moment as I went through my high school years. The biggest moment of self-reflection, and I would say the wake-up call moment from when I was young, I had a best friend in high school. His name was Ben Rios. He was the drummer in my band. We played soccer together. And back in the time when I grew up in high school, there was not social media. There wasn't even cell phones or anything. You would all meet at the local Burger King or McDonald's, and you'd find out where the parties were, and you'd kind of like, it was a hub and spoke. You'd go there, you'd go to the party got boring, you'd go back, find out where else to go. So Ben and another friend of mine, his name was Chris Casanova, we would always go together. We were, the three amigos. And one night, I was very infatuated with a girl, first name Jenny. And Jenny called me, and Jenny happened to smoke cigarettes. Like, we're going way back to when that was sort of a normal thing to do, right? And she's like, can you bring me a pack of cigarettes? And I was so infatuated in love that I went and I was like, sure, of course, I'll get you a pack of cigarettes. And so I said to Ben and to Chris, I'll see you at Burger King. So I go see Jenny, drop off a pack of cigarettes. I'm driving back to Burger King, and I make a turn onto one of the streets that heads towards Burger King. And in my rearview mirror, it's like, to me, Hiroshima. Huge explosion in my rearview mirror. And so I turn around just to see, oh my gosh, what happened, right? So I turn the car around, go back, and as I get closer to this, there's clearly a Volkswagen Bug in flames, which is what my friend Ben, was actually Chris's car, but Ben would have been in with Chris. And as I get closer and closer, it just dawns on me that, oh my gosh, that's Chris and Ben, and the car's in flames. And so I parked my car, run over, and I tried to pull Ben out of the flames. Chris was able to get out, and it got too hot. I mean, it's just either I die with him or, and so I had to let go, and Ben ended up dying. And, I don't feel that's my fault at all, but what a heavy moment, like, in life, right? And for me, as I processed that in the weeks that followed and in the months that followed, a couple things just became clear in my life. So one thing that became clear was, it would be what psychologists now would call non-attachment. It would be like, nothing actually matters that much at the end of the day. Yet somehow everything matters a lot, and I'll get to that. But sort of non-attachment to the outcome in terms of, and maybe it goes back to the serenity prayer, as simple as that, which is, God, help me to change the things I can, accept the things I can't, and to know the difference. And just that whole notion of like, at some point, life is going to be, another way to look at it is the existential view of there's just an absurdity of that is part of life, and you just need to accept that. At the same time, though, had I not done everything I could to try and pull Ben out, I think I would have regrets about that. I think that would torment me. And I don't feel like I left anything, if I go to a sporting analogy, I left it all out on the field, at Burns, I had the works. And I think that moment where it was just like, okay, it's okay to strive for something, but at the end of the day, whether you get there or not, what matters is the striving. That just became crystal for me. And to whatever I did from then on, I just thought, I'm going to put everything into it and make it matter, make it meaningful. That's my choice to make it meaningful. But I'm also not going to be attached to the outcome. So, I can want things, but there's nothing I really need, if you will, is another way to put it. So those things were, quite ingrained in me, and through self-reflection. It's the first time I remember actually kind of reflecting on what does all this mean. And then the last thing is just sort of the life is short concept, right? And so focus on things that that you feel matter and that give you joy and that give joy to others. And later in life, I found this guy who had written this blog post, which I loved. He said, it's hell yeah or no. And what he did is he took everything in his life and he rated it on a hell yeah scale. And so it was like, when I do that, is it hell yeah? When I go to work in the morning, when I spend time with my friend, when I do, et cetera. And basically what he said was, if it's not an 8, 9, or 10 on my hell yeah scale, I'm going to say no. And I'm going to clean up my life from the clutter. And, I do think there are some obligations you have in life. There are some citizenship oriented things we need to do that might not be hell yeah, but by and large, to hone in on those things in life that are a hell yeah for you. And I really did that without calling it that, coming out of that Ben experience. So that was my first kind of big wake up call, I would say. Now, when it came then, if you talked about what's the banner over your life or the purpose statement or whatever, this is one of those things where I'll go all the way back to that. You have a senior statement, a senior quote, they call it, in your yearbook when you're a senior in high school, right? So I had been through this thing with Ben, and otherwise had a pretty normal high school. But when it came time to, Scott, what's your senior quote? For whatever reason, and in the same way that a lot of things for me, it's just like I just let it channel through. I don't really premeditate it and think it. It's just because I've got a heavy metal song in my head versus I'm really thinking too much about the anxiety on whatever I'm about to do. But it's just like, liberate the light in man. And that was a little phrase from a band called Armored Saint that was written on one of their CD covers. But I remember I saw it once and I was just like, liberate the light in man. That matters. Now I would say liberate the light in humans. This was back in the 80s when there was less sensitivity to the wording. But that notion of liberate the light in man, it exists to liberate the light in humankind. That touched me for whatever reason enough to make it a senior statement that stuck out among all the other ones in terms of like, well, that's a little weird. Why did Scott pick that? But I then follow the thread through my life, and I see how that takes me to the Jackson story, probably, that mission statement has become an overriding mission statement, personally, professionally, and kind of quite encompassing, and not a bad title to, something hopefully you could put on my gravestone, that kind of thing. So if I go to the Jackson story, I had gone to the University of Notre Dame, partially because of its Catholic character and the spiritual side of it, and I was really drawn to that. I had studied mechanical engineering, and I loved the tangibility of that and the kind of being able to make stuff, do things. And McKinsey had recruited me, and at the same time I had been courting a woman who I met while traveling, and she lived in London. I lived in the US, but she was from Australia. Things went well, and I had the choice of, do I stay in Cleveland and ask her to come there in Cleveland, Ohio, or do I go down and live in Melbourne, Australia with her, because she was headed back to Australia. So I've said it before on things like this, but hardly a choice for me. It was Australia all the way. And I got to Australia. With McKinsey, I had done a lot of more operational oriented work because of my background as a mechanical engineer. And then in Australia, they do a lot of strategy work. So I did a lot of strategy work as well. We had our first child. We did all the things that you would kind of normally do in life as you develop professionally and have more means to, anyway. And we had our second child, who was Jackson, who you met earlier. Jackson's official diagnosis was profound diffuse bilateral brain damage. And what that meant practically was he had no voluntary movement. He was cortically blind and cortically deaf, which means there's nothing wrong with his eyes per se from the equipment standpoint, but his ability to process that signal is actually not. It's, the cells are dead. He has lesions throughout his brain, so clumps of dead cells. That was, again, talk about a wake-up call moment. What do you do when that comes into your life? And everything was sort of, going really well also. And it just like, it felt like I was hitting a brick wall in terms of, oh my gosh, where did this come from? And, and I didn't choose this, and why do I deserve this? And my wife in particular went through quite a struggle coming to terms with it. First of all, there could be anything wrong with Jackson. So that was hard in our relationship to begin with, where I would look at him and be like, he's not doing what our other son did. I think there's something wrong here, profoundly wrong here. And she was like, no, boys are just slower, and then when it did come to bear that he had, a brain injury, she really struggled spiritually as well with, why did God choose to bring that into our lives? And this is where I feel like I was just blessed that there were people who I was able to connect with in the quest to help Jackson, especially early on, who they just helped me frame things that I was probably predisposed to frame them as. But it was, any upset that happens in life, if viewed as a setup for growth and in your own growth, becomes, everything. It can be a dark cloud, but it will have a silver lining. And also that, meaning is so much of a choice you make, not something you find. And so we chose to look at Jackson, and I've said it before on some podcasts and things, but one of the doctors basically, they said, look, he's going to be like a doorstop. That was his prognosis. And I think that's an interesting, it's a terrible thing to say about any human life. But he was trying to just get us to have the reality dose of, look, you're going to have to check him into an institution and there's nothing you can do. But this notion of like, wait, we can choose what we believe. Goes back to kind of Viktor Frankl's statement of, in between stimulus and response lies the freedom of choice. At the end of the day, that might be a crazy thought, might not be totally detached from reality, but it's a bit like the Michelangelo looking at the stone and saying, there's an angel to be freed here. We just chose to say, like, look, you might see him as a doorstop, but we're not going to accept that. And that's where I think the link back to Ben is a through line in what happened with my friend Ben, because we ended up completely turning our lives upside down to follow what a lot of people would have said was just a crazy program of essentially intensive stimulus on Jackson. So, what we were kind of told was everyone, when they're born into the world, is actually kind of blind, deaf in a sense, and Mother Nature essentially turns on those senses as you come out of the womb. So the theory was turn up Mother Nature 1,000-fold. If that hasn't worked, just the normal process, turn up Mother Nature 1,000-fold in terms of the frequency, intensity, and duration of stimulus that you're demanding of the body. And so we would put air horns in his ears 100 times a day and just like blast him. And we would put a tungsten halogen bulb in his eyes, just, a couple inches away. And we would just turn it on and leave it blasted for a few seconds and then turn it off, turn it on again. And I used to lift him onto a slide that any movement, even if involuntary, would move him slightly down, but not all the way. So, and his food was at the bottom. And so the idea was that over time, you don't know how many times you have to lift him up and how long you have to get the angle, the gradient just right, so that, and we'd poke him and stuff to get a little movement or something, some reactions, and then he'd slide down a little bit. And again, you don't know what frequency, intensity, or duration it will take, but at some point the brain will say, I need to move to get food, or there's so much noise out there, I need to open up and hear what it is. And the idea is that there's a part of the brain that will take over for where the dead part of the dead cells are and take on that function. So we, again, turned our lives upside down. Stimulus was even in terms of, we wore the brightest colored clothes. We bought soccer jerseys that are kind of this neon yellow. We covered the walls with as brightest stuff as we could, checkerboarded. So people went from meeting Scott, the business consultant who would wear a suit every day, to Scott, who had grown this long beard and had his, wore these neon clothes and had this, house that was like Technicolor and had volunteers from our church coming in 24/7 to do all these different exercises with Jackson to help our family. And people were like, wow, you guys are kind of over the top. And a lot of them said, you have false hope. You have false hope. Like, this might work, but it's probably not going to work. And you're kind of wasting your life. I took 6 months off work to do this. And so at the time, no one knew if I was going to go back to work and things like that too. Like, wow, you're like, your wife stopped her career, you're stopping your career. What are you doing? Even my wife's family was kind of like, these are crazy. Jackson was born to be who he is. Just let him be who he is and like get on with your life. The reason I say all that is because for me, it didn't matter if it worked. Obviously, I wanted it to work. Obviously, we wanted nothing more. And we had these goals for Jackson, which was if he can just have the function that makes us human, opposed forefinger and thumb to be able to write, to be able to coordinate your lips, your nose, your throat, your breath, to be able to speak, to be able to walk on 2 feet, to be able to converge your eyes, to read. Like, he didn't have any of that. And some would say he never would have had any of that. And we said, well, let's set those as our initial goals. And then ultimately beyond that, we want him to be able to have friends and be able to do work in the world that he feels has worth and the world feels has worth, different things, a sense of spirituality, etc. But a lot of people said, okay, pipe dream, no chance. And I just went back to, I'm going to do everything I can for this kid, and it's either going to work or it's not. And at the end of the day, if it doesn't work, it's not wasted time because I'm pulling as hard as I can, and that's the kind of the flavor of how we approached it. Now, fortunately for us, And I say this with a huge amount of just, again, feeling blessed, because there are parents who have worked just as hard or harder with their children than we worked with Jackson, who don't end up having success. We did. We were so fortunate that it was hard gained, and we always hoped he would just turn on at one point and everything would go. Never happened. So, but yeah, sure enough, one day his eyes moved when we did those air horns, meaning he heard something, we thought. And so we would just, keep doing it. And of course it's not like it just turned on, but over the course of a few weeks, he all of a sudden was responding to sound. And over the course of a little while, it took there's all sorts of data on this I have online. I have a little video of his journey, but over 9 months, he sort of learned to get down the slide such that you could lower the gradient a little bit. And then it's harder for him. He masters that, lower it a little more. He masters that, lower it a little more. He masters that. All of a sudden, you've got a kid who's bizarrely, strangely commando crawling, but he's making it across a flat floor. And you say, well, how do we get him to crawl on all fours properly? Well, put a little hurdle in there. So he masters half-inch hurdles, goes, through like 5 or 6 of them to get to his food. Then they become an inch, then they become 2 inches, 3 inches. As soon as there's 6-inch hurdles and he's going over 6 of them, you've got a kid who now can crawl on all fours. And then walking, it was, an overhead ladder. We built an overhead ladder, and we had 4 adults helping him through this overhead ladder movement, doing a cross pattern of what you do in walking. Then, he starts to master enough that you can move to 2 adults. Then you can pull the adults away. He can sort of do it himself. Then you lift the ladder, was adjustable. So I built it with my dad, and it was like a monkey bars that you could lift it, make the ladder higher. And so then he could barely touch these rungs. He masters that. Then you give him a balancing stick to be able to walk to his food. And then you take the balance. You have a kid who can walk. Oh my gosh. Now, how do we get him to run? You take him on top of a hill and you push him. I love that one, because you're either going to fall or you're going to learn to run. It was so interesting. And so we used to bring him up to the top of the hill, kind of, push him obviously, but you nudge him down, and he, starts to run, might fall, gets himself up. You help him get up and you push him a little more. Anyway, do that for a year and you've got a kid who can run. And then you do it for, so everything has come hard. Speaking, then we had created a child who had all that function I talked about, who was actually dangerous in the world because he didn't have the social emotional awareness to manage all that. And again, people said, well, see, we told you so. He wasn't meant to have all this capability. You've done something unnatural here, and now you're going to pay the price, and he's going to be dangerous. And anyway, we worked really hard. That's part of why we came to Seal Beach, is there's a group here who has a technique called ABA, which they actually use with autism more than anything. And it's a behavioral modification approach, and that works reasonably well for Jackson, and we pushed that really hard. And anyway, we've got a kid now. He has an 8 at high school. He's about to graduate on a highly adjusted program, because mentally he's probably got the intellect of an 8-year-old. But he can walk, he can talk, he can work in the world. So he's been an amazing journey, and that unlocking of potential in him, and especially when we started to see it early, it made me in my professional life think, do I want to go back and do the next strategy study? And also, by the way, that was so intense that a McKinsey lifestyle is quite intense itself, and I wanted to put more time hands-on with my son. So I was going to leave McKinsey, and I had actually tendered my resignation, and my office manager in Australia sat me down and he said, Scott, we all know what you're doing with your son, and we're impressed that you're putting that much effort into it, and we're wishing you all the best. It's an intensive program with professionals from around the world, and you're going to need to put fuel in that tank, so to speak. So you're going to have a professional job to pay for all this. If you leave McKinsey, that professional job is probably going to be something you're going to go to at 7 a.m. in the morning and come back maybe 6 p.m. at night. You're gonna be gone for all the waking hours of Jackson during the week anyway, just by nature, and you'll want to do a good job at whatever job you're doing just because of who you are. So Scott, what is it you want to do with your life that would be meaningful enough to be leaving what's happening at home with Jackson every day, and that would have value that was commensurate with what was happening at home? Think about what that is, and then come back and tell me why you can't do that at McKinsey. that was a really, really powerful question. That would be another kind of wake up call moment in life. Because it translated what was happening at home. It helped me connect it to my work life. So, I had been reading Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, had come out fairly recently at that point. Bowling Alone is about how human beings and humankind's meaning is found increasingly less in places like community groups, church affiliations, your local Lions Club, even in friendships, and more is found in kind of your work identity and in your commercial identity, so to speak, in terms of like what I have, what I buy, what I own, what I wear. Things wrapped up in the business world, both of those pieces. You spend a huge amount of your life in the workplace, right? So that was striking to me. And there was also there's a great quote from a guy named David White, who I never forgot, because it basically said, work paradoxically doesn't ask enough of us, yet it exhausts that part of us that we bring to its door. Something like that, right? And I thought like those kind of things were going through my head, and I thought, what if all these things I've learned in my personal life around how meaning is a choice, and around how non-attachment is essentially freeing yourself from fear in some ways. So it's not acting out of fight, flight, or freeze. It's acting out of flow, if you will. And what if people found more flow in the workplace? I'm not the only one who's thought these thoughts. Like, there's a lot of people who have worked all in this space, but I got kind of infatuated with the idea of, wow, there's this world out there of thinking around human potential that at least I haven't experienced being brought into the workplace and present in a meaningful way. And I think you made the point in the introduction that, when you read my bio on some of the things I've led at McKinsey, there's a little bit of like, oh, I wonder how that went over. Because when I got back into the McKinsey, I chose to come back to McKinsey, and my whole goal was essentially, how do we liberate the lighted man, so to speak, equivalent of how do we unlock human potential in the workplace, because that will be just as good for profits as it will be for people. It's a win-win. And so it does fit in McKinsey. And where better to do that than a place like McKinsey that touches most of the large corporations that much of Western society works within anyway. It all felt like, oh my gosh, I was here all along. I was just kind of not doing the right thing. So there was another colleague of mine, Michael Rennie, who had come back from having Hodgkin's lymphoma and had gone through a similar journey in his personal life. And the two of us, and another guy who just was attracted to it, his name was David Levy, we started something called the Performance Leadership Institute down in Australia. It was essentially to take the field of human potential and bring it into the workplace. How do we use personal transformation as a vehicle to aid company transformation towards creating workplaces that are, more motivating and unleashing of the human spirit and potential, such that, and one of the phrases we used, which really turned people off, was like, we want to bring love into business. And the idea of that wasn't love like hugs and things. It was freeing us of the fear and letting people act out of a point of choice and not out of a point of reactivity, out of a point of creativity in the workplace. That did not get received well by many of our colleagues and even some of our clients, where they're just like, oh, okay, you've gone overboard, you're off the ranch. Fortunately, we had the chance, in part because we were in Australia, to experiment. I think if you're in a global firm and you want to experiment on somewhere, like we went to Perth, Australia, which is about as far away geographically as you can get from anywhere else. And if it went terrible, then no one would hear about it. And if it went great, we could radiate it out. And anyway, we worked with a company called Woodside Petroleum. This is well documented in some of my books and stuff, so I'm not giving away any client names or anything. And anyway, that program went extremely well, and unlocked a lot of potential. The one way we talked about it was, it's sort of, instead of a change program that companies do, taking a company from being a caterpillar to a bigger, fuzzier caterpillar, we literally are trying to do the caterpillar to butterfly. And why that's important is because that change comes deep and innate from inside that organism in a way that it can't go back. So by working at the level of mindsets and the level of basic beliefs in an organization, we can actually create fundamental and permanent and lasting change, versus we take a caterpillar, it's bigger, fuzzier, fatter, but then it's going to skinny down again. And, you get these cycles in corporate life where it just is, we go from a focus on cost to a focus on growth, but now we're back to a focus on cost, and we centralize, we decentralize. And so the idea was, can we break through all that? So anyway, it became successful enough that I was able to write a book about it. That book became quite popular. Culture work in my life became something that grafted on naturally to performance work. So if a company has a big performance challenge and wants to do a big change program, become a butterfly from a caterpillar, you would want to infuse the culture work we were doing, because any change program that doesn't require change in human behavior probably isn't a meaningful change. And if you want to have change in human behavior, to incorporate the inner game, the inside out stuff, as well as the things you're going to do with incentives and systems and processes, probably a pretty smart thing to do. So I ended up becoming involved in kind of big, large corporate changes. Those are usually led by new CEOs. So that led me into the zone of, I was often counseling and working directly with a new CEO, which then became, you get enough pattern recognition and reps doing that, and you get a radiating reference. And then that's how we ended up with me leading our CEO excellence practice, co-leading it with Carolyn Dewar, and writing the book that we just did, which was CEO excellence. And maybe just to put a fine point on the path, and then I'll let you ask some questions here. What was really exciting and profound for me was, as we talked to these CEOs, so we analytically determined who are the best CEOs, most successful CEOs of this century so far. And we did that by saying, well, first of all, how many, we had to bound it somehow. And so we started with, how many souls have been in the CEO chair of the 1,000 largest companies in the world. So that's just how we started our data set. And there's 2,400 of those. And we said, okay, how many of those souls sat in that chair for more than 6 years? Because if they didn't really have to eat their own cooking, so to speak. And they didn't prove that they had the trust of their stakeholders, and they didn't, kind of have a through line that was long enough to really count them in that group. So that narrowed it down to about 1,000 roughly. And then we said, look, in a world of stakeholder capitalism, there still is shareholder value that's important. So we should have a shareholder lens. So are you creating value for your shareholders above your peers? So what we didn't want to do is have, a bunch of high-tech CEOs showing up as the best CEOs because they happen to be, get a good wave to surf, whereas other people didn't have a good wave to surf. That, has nothing to do with whether you're a good surfer. It's just you happen to catch the perfect wave. So we did versus your peers in industry, and we also netted out the effect of geography. So if you happen to be in Latin America in a high growth arena, or in Europe in a low growth, we weren't penalized. So we took top 2 quintiles of value creating CEOs. And then we said, look, stakeholder capitalism is real. What is your track record of impact on the environment, on social issues, ethics, integrity, etc.? And that narrowed us down to 143 CEOs. And we thought that was a pretty good list until we really looked at it through the lens of diversity and said, man, there is a lot of white guys here. And there were too many North Americans as well. So we then added back to our list CEOs from outside the top 1,000 largest companies, but still who lead large companies. And some were private companies, some are not for profit, some are just, instead of being 10 billion in revenue, they're 5 billion in revenue. And instead of being 50,000 employees, they're 10,000 employees. Still huge companies, but just not in that group. And we added back for geographic, racial and gender diversity to get a good balance, what we felt was a good balance. We then had 200 CEOs. We added back to 200 because it was a nice round number. And we said, okay, that would take a long time to interview 200 CEOs. So let's take a statistically valid sample. That the numbers say that's 65. So we interviewed 65 CEOs who we had quantitatively identified as what we felt were the best this century today. Now, why that's important and how it links to the story, my story, is that one of the big, what I felt was profound, but others around me did too, so it wasn't just my lens on it. It was how much those specific CEOs that we looked at embodied the notion that, look, if you want to talk about what great means, don't talk about me and my greatness. talk about how I've put the conditions in place for others to be great, how I've liberated the light in others, so to speak. That was the mindset these CEOs had towards their role. It was a servant leader mindset, and Reed Hastings, I've shared this in a few different podcasts, but it's such a great story. I just want to tell it in every one. He talked to us, Reed Hastings is the CEO of Netflix, and he talked to us about where he learned his leadership ethos. And it was before he started Netflix. And it was when he was a young software engineer, and he's working for a small company. And, he would get obsessed with the program he was doing, and he would work most of the night, and he would drink a lot of coffee. And then he would go home, get some sleep, come back, work some more, etc. But at the end of the night, there would be coffee cups everywhere, because he had just gone through so much coffee during the day. And whenever he got back, though, the coffee cups would be cleaned and put away, and he'd get new ones out and start his coffee run again for the day. Anyway, one night he goes home, very early morning as it is, and he's got busy brain, like we do, where you can't sleep, you got stuff going through your head, and so much so that he's like, I got to get back in the office. And so he goes back in the office about 2 hours after he had left. And first thing he does is he goes in to get a cup of coffee to get started. And as he's going in, he sees someone washing the coffee cups, and then he does a double take. And his double take is because he sees the CEO of the company washing his coffee cups. And so Reed looks at him deadpan straight in the eye and says, what are you doing? And the CEO looks at Reed and goes, Reed, you do so much for us. This is the least I can do for you. And little did he know that this entire time it was the CEO who would always come in early, would always clean up Reed's workstation. And he said, for me, I would follow that guy to the ends of the universe. Just because of that ethos, right? And so Reed talked about how he's always tried to embody that ethos. And that was Reed's story, but I felt like it was so much a part of everyone's story. Greg Quesadayon talked about I just want to be the best bag carrier I can be for all my colleagues, And so for me, that what was really, I guess, cool for me, I don't know, I'm sure there's a cooler word than cool to use here, or a more sophisticated word, but it was really cool for me to think that, wow, 20 years ago, Jackson set me on this journey where I think it solidified in my professional life this notion of could I be part of making liberate the light in man, or liberate the light in humankind real in the workplace. And I felt like I had done a lot of that through the client work and research and writing that I had done around the culture side of leading organizations. But now there's 60, we ended up interviewing 67 CEOs because we were oversubscribed, but now there's 67 CEOs who are shouting that leadership idea from the rooftops. Not because of me, but I'm able to bring those voices out at a scale now where, people want to read this not because Scott Keller wrote it, it's because Jamie Dimon is sharing his insights, and Satya Nadella is sharing his insights, Marilyn Houston's sharing her insights, and Piyush Gupta is sharing his insights, et cetera, et cetera. And because of that, it's a New York Times bestseller. And because of that, a lot of people are reading it. And wow, I've been a small part of helping midwife a broader appreciation for a lot of people who are reading this of that very thing which sparked that interest so long ago for me. So for me, it's a real full circle moment that I'm, I do get goosebumps when I think about it. So that's my through line story for what it's worth, Mark.
Well, I'm mesmerized. It's were you aware, as you were sharing it with me and our listeners, that in real time there was a journey that you were sharing with us, and along the journey, dots were connecting organically. There was almost a flow to the way you shared the story, and I almost think of a blob of mercury and how it goes along, and then it impacts another little piece of mercury, and then it comes in, and then it comes in, and then it comes in. I mean, have you ever heard of the term sense of coherence?
I've heard of each of those words, but not put together in exactly that way. So I'm sure it means something.
I think the person who originated, I'm sure I'm botching it, I think his name was Antonovsky. But part of what he was saying is that a sense of coherence is made up of three components. it's comprehensible, it's manageable, and it's meaningful. And when you can present something that hits on all of those things, there's a sense of coherence, and it's calming to chaos, both within your mind and to people around you. So I was just, I wasn't hypnotized, but I was mesmerized, because as you were just describing it, from Jackson all the way through your journey, and how you came upon selecting the proper CEOs and the various filters you used, and then what you came upon, and then how you then reached out to these people who everybody wants to hear from, and then voila, it's a New York Times bestseller. But well, you've probably told this story before, but I'm going to send you the video. But if you can listen to yourself through someone else's ears, I think you'll appreciate it, that it was exquisitely coherent.
I'll do that. I mean, I do feel like my ride in this arena, it hasn't felt like it's sort of, I set my sights on that hilltop, and I had to like climb up these sheer faces, and a struggle in that way. It feels more like I was able to kind of look down at like that little clearing in the wilderness looks right, and then I just like laid down in the river and let myself, didn't fight it, you know what I mean? I let myself kind of flow through the rocks, as opposed to trying to swim towards it, so I credit a guiding hand in that it's worked this way far more than my own doing, put it that way. And in that way, I can see the coherence, but it's not like I was planning the coherence, the way it might otherwise come across. So
yeah. And are you familiar with the inner game work of Tim Gallwey?
Absolutely. Yep.
So Tim's a friend of mine.
Oh, cool.
And we just spoke not too long ago, and he started with the inner game of tennis, then inner game of golf, inner game of skiing, inner game of work. He may have done inner game of music, but I was drawn to him because it was, don't get attached to the end result, increase your awareness of the moment and what you want it to be. Then I'll share this with you, because then this is why I had to meet him. So, I was a psychotherapist, and I, did work in suicide prevention, but I would also do couples therapy. And so I took it into my couples therapy room. So imagine this, there's a husband and wife, and I said, pick up 3 topics that you can never talk about without getting into an argument. Money, sex, in-laws, whatever. I say, pick one that you can't talk about without getting into an argument. And so they picked one, money. And then I said to each of them, show me the way you'd like to talk about it to each other if you could. And then they'd start out, well, she, he, you, whatever. And I said, wait. The other person just arched their back. Are you sure this is the way you'd like to talk about it? Because if you check their body language, this is not going anyplace good. And so they'd pause. And then after about 3 reminders, I'd say, show me the way you'd like to talk about it. It would shift from them blaming to, I'm just frustrated. I'm scared. I'm just scared about, money.
Yeah. And
it just changed it. So that's when I reached out to Tim, because he lived in Southern California. I said, Tim, you don't know me, but I got to tell you. And so we became friends, and pretty good friends. And then we've come back into each other's life recently, but I'm sharing it with you because I don't know if there's some resonance from what I'm sharing with you, but it just feels like as you were just sharing your story seamlessly, it just overflowed with this sense of coherence. So I hope I'll send you the video, and I hope you watch it. And, and try not to be overly critical about your voice or yada, yada, like we all do.
Yeah.
but it was,
I'll probably just have a heavy metal song in my head instead of instead of analyzing it that way. But actually, I was just going to mention Timothy Galway just to give him props. The whole notion that there's an equation he has, this P equals P minus I, performance equals potential minus interference, and the interference is the inner game. But that I use that all the time, and I talk about the interference as the inner game, and it's also, you link it to the Gandhi's kind of aphorism on, we stand in a circle whose circumference is bounded by our own fears. And you get to what you're talking about in the therapy room, is at the end of the day, like, I just have this big fear about money, or fear of that, rejection, or fear of, and having that awareness around those things, and the ability to kind of not let those drive us, but be aware of those things and then make positive choices. That's a big part of, how, what we endeavored to bring into business. And I'll add one more thing to that, because it means so much to me. DeWitt Jones, who's sort of a famous photographer from National Geographic, he has this beautiful statement around, I used to believe the way life worked was that I'll believe it when I see it. And he said, the more I worked for the Geographic, the more I realized that the way life really works is I'll see it when I believe it. And that whole notion of being able to, believe in something, and as soon as you do, you notice things you never otherwise would have noticed. You've set an intention into the world that actually draws things to you to assist you and aid you towards that goal. There's such a big set of thinking in there, and such power and all that. So I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that, and the Timothy Galway role in bringing that to the mainstream.
So thank you so much. And to our listeners, thank you for listening in. I hope you were as mesmerized as I was. And it's rare to find someone who is a great storyteller, but the story teaches you much more that you can actually apply to your business life and to the way you live your life. And so it was a real gift to have Scott on. And I know I speak for my listeners in thanking you. And I know I speak for Scott in thanking you, our listeners, for listening to this. So everyone, take care, be well. When those wake-up calls come, pick one of them. There'll be a bus. If you miss the next one, there'll be another bus saying wake-up call, and catch it, and you'll be glad that you did. Thank you, everyone.